And welcome back. Thank you for joining us here on TV on World Tonight.
That's right. And we're going to focus on the Middle East now, especially these new reports we're hearing out of Gaza and potential war crimes. And we've joined now by Mark Toth, a national security and foreign policy expert. Good to have you on the program.
Good evening. Thank you.
Now, Mark, let's start with what we know, what we have. We're getting reports out of Gaza, apparently mass grave sites in different locations, also very much in the south. More than 300 bodies been uncovered from a hospital. So what are we looking at here? What's your take on this? I mean, this is obviously shocking on many, many other shocking things that we're hearing. What do you make of it?
On a humanitarian level, obviously, you're always concerned when you hear of mass graves. The problem that we're faced with right now is we just don't know what we are seeing. Israel acknowledges that at some point during its operations against the Shifa hospital in particular, that they did exhume bodies that Hamas had buried to identify any potential October 7th hostages that may have been killed and were in those graves. It is not clear yet who buried the people there. Israel denies they're the ones that did it. So presumably at this point, those are in areas controlled by Hamas. They are the ones that buried them. Now, we also don't know who those people are. Are they Hamas fighters? Are they civilians that were caught in crossfire? Were they civilians killed by Hamas firing at Israelis? Or, opposite, was it civilians being killed by IDF forces? We just don't know. At this point, we have allegations, but no proof, no substantiation.
Right, so still a lot of question needs to be answered. Now, the UN has called for an independent, effective and transparent investigation. Now, in your opinion, what institution is able to conduct such investigation?
At this point, that type of call is going to be exceedingly difficult to pull off. Israel is in the midst of a war in Gaza. It's intending on destroying Hamas. It probably is getting ready to invade Rafah. And I just do not see that kind of investigation occurring easily. Again, at this point, it's based on unconfirmed reports, or unsubstantiated would be a better word. And I don't see Israel being deterred from what its focus is, which is destroying Hamas. And I think it's also important to add that we don't know if this is just a delay or a distraction tactic on the part of Hamas to delay the inevitable invasion, if you will, that's going to be happening in Rafah. So again, it's just not clear what we're seeing yet. I wish I had better answers for you, but right now the fog of war is very real here.
Yeah, indeed. And of course, as you mentioned, there's a lot of questions here in terms of evidence. Who are these bodies? Who put them there? Very much so. But nevertheless, at the same time, I think it's also going to show and probably reflect on Israel if it doesn't necessarily take action on this. As you said, there's a fog of war. We know that potentially Rafah might happen in terms of an offensive. But how damaging would this then now be for Israel to ignore and just deny and not be part of this potential, whatever it may be, investigation?
Israel obviously needs to get ahead of the curve. It's in their national interest to do so. I think also they need to make the case that when you look at Israel in terms of the civilian casualties in this war, they actually are far less than the rate that the U.S. caused in Iraq, markedly so. We're talking by a multiple factor. And I bring up Iraq because you have a comparable urban warfare setting. So from that standpoint, Israel has done a good job is the wrong term here, because anytime civilians die, it's a tragedy, and that's a humanitarian crisis. But comparably to the U.S.'s own military campaigns in Iraq, Israel has minimized to the greatest extent possible the civilian deaths in Gaza. And they're facing an enemy that chooses to fight behind their civilians, which complicates that endeavor. So for sure, enable it. But the difficulty is that Israel right now is conducting full-scale operations. To simply ask them to stop and to entertain this investigation at this point may not be feasible on the battlefield. Time will tell. Israel needs time to react and to state its own position.
Yeah, I know. I know it's not feasible on the battlefield, but I think it's just comes with an array of already very, very complicated situations, tragic situations where there have been that friendly fire with its own hostages some time ago. Now we've had those aid workers killed. Now this, as we don't know, of course, who, as you said, we don't know who's put them there, but it just goes with another list. And it seems always that the reasoning behind it is really say, well, we can't do this now. We've got to keep on. It's war. We need to go. So I'm just wondering, at which point can there be a pause to look at some of these issues? Because it seems that they're stacking up.
Right. Yeah, I think you have to go back. It's a fair question. It's a fair moral question. But I think you have to go back and look at this from the standpoint, what country ever in the midst of a major war has just stopped and paused to conduct these kinds of investigations? It's a big ask of a military that, in their view, is fighting an existential war, not one just against Hamas, but this is part and parcel to what Israel sees as a wider war against Iran that has attempted to encircle it. And you've got to also bear in mind that even Fatah, in a report that just came out, was saying that Hamas has staged a lot of these things. And this is Fatah in the West Bank reporting. Now, obviously, they're opposed to Hamas and those two entities as Palestinian groups that clash with each other. But Fatah is saying that Hamas has staged deaths, has stolen food and the like. So again, from Israel's standpoint, it has to weigh that. It's one way or the other, its image around the world is going to take a hit.
That's
and,
right.
and they may feel like they've got to take Hamas out in Rafah and take those hits as they may come.
Now, IDF has issued a warning to people in parts of northern Gaza, saying you are in a dangerous combat zone. The IDF will work with extreme force against terrorist infrastructure and subversive elements in the region. Now, in Gaza, there are 1.2 million people, innocent people. We know that among them, there are probably Hamas members. But do you believe that IDF, Israel, has a plan to somehow save the innocent? I mean, 1.2 million. That's a lot of people, and they're not backing out. They're going to finish this.
You know, as I mentioned a few minutes ago, the civilian casualty rate in Gaza is exceedingly low compared to the United States and Iraq. Israel has shown and demonstrated that they've tried to minimize civilian deaths. Now, when you have an enemy that's fighting behind its own civilians, putting its own women, men, and children in harm's way, that becomes an even harder task. That wasn't the case in Iraq. People weren't fighting behind civilians. Hamas is. So from that standpoint, yes, Israel has to nonetheless figure out ways to improve that, to save as many lives as they can. I know there are ongoing discussions right now in Egypt, as well as in Cyprus, for how to create these humanitarian corridors to better coordinate food, medicine, getting to them. And I know Israel in the past has preemptively warned Gazans or civilian Palestinians that are in harm's way that they need to leave certain areas. Now, certainly when it comes to southern Gaza and Rafah and any incursion there, Israel's going to have to provide for much wider corridors because that's where the bulk of the population currently is at, the 1.2 million that you referenced. Still a considerable amount more than Gaza, but clearly Israel's signaling that they need to leave. And in the past, Hamas has prevented that. Hopefully they won't going forward.
Yeah, just a quick comment on this, because you reference Iraq as an example, saying that civilian casualties have been less in this offensive by Israel in the Gaza Strip. But then you could probably, there'd be another interview of how the reasons for going in Iraq are also something that, you know, we never found those weapons of mass destruction. I mean, it's a different case, a different story, but nevertheless also, I think,
also leaving Iraq,
yeah,
right?
leaving Iraq, which I think was another complex one. But to the point as well, we've just had President Biden sign this huge aid bill. It's obviously not just for Ukraine, but it's also for Taiwan and Israel. There's $95 billion in total. A lot of that is also earmarked for Israel. What kind of impact is that going to have? I mean, I assume that Israel was not short on weapons, but what kind of impact will that have on any potential more offensive into Rafah or anywhere else?
Right. Most of that aid is going to replenish missiles that were used in defending itself from an Iranian attack. Israel at this point is capable of taking on Hamas itself. So that from that standpoint, the United States commitment to Israel is strong. It's a bipartisan. It's been there in Congress. Others around the world may disagree with it, but I can assure viewers that's simply not going to change. the bulk of the United States Congress is not going to turn its back on Israel, despite our own protests happening here on campuses around the United States. So from that standpoint, I would really view that aid that Israel's getting, look at it more as strategic in terms of what it needs to defend itself against Iran, as opposed to more on a microscopic level, what it needs to take out Hamas, because those are two different things. And we're seeing Israel increasingly do that. There were 40 strikes overnight against Hezbollah in Iran. Half of the Hezbollah 40 strikes in Lebanon against Hezbollah. Half of Hezbollah's commanders in southern Lebanon are dead. And so that's really where the bulk of this munitions that are coming, as well as funding, are going to be projected to in terms of force projection.
Now, Israel is really being pressured by the entire world to stop this war. Even in New York, we see protests of students in New York universities. Now, we hear that Turkish leader Erdogan said that Turkey is no longer maintaining intensive trade relations with Israel. So this situation is going to take toll on Israel. But how big of a hit is it for that country?
Erdogan has a habit of saying one thing publicly to mollify his street, and quite another when it comes to behind the scenes. Now, candidly, I've not yet looked into that to see whether or not there's been actual suspension of trade between the two countries. So at this point, I would argue what we're probably looking at is just talk. Now, if he starts to back it up, then we'll have to recalibrate and look at it. Certainly, trade relations have improved vastly between Ankara and Jerusalem over the past several decades. But that also is a double-edged sword for Erdogan. He needs that trade as much as Israel does.
Right.
Yeah.
I'll believe it when I see it.
All right. So, and indeed, a lot of interesting things wrapping up there. The latest situation from Gaza and the Middle East. Thanks, Mark Toth there. Appreciate your insights.
Thank you so
Appreciate
very
it.
much.